The television cast its pale blue glow across the living room. The volume turned so low I could barely make out the commentators discussing a play that had happened hours ago. The replay flickered against the beige walls, shadows of men colliding and separating in endless loops. I sat on the edge of the couch, still wearing the pressed white shirt I had put on for dinner with Evelyn, the collar now loose around my neck, the sleeves rolled halfway up my forearms. The whiskey sat untouched on the coffee table, amber liquid catching the light from the screen. I had poured it an hour ago, maybe two. Time moved differently in those late hours, stretching and contracting like something alive. The ice had long since melted, leaving the glass warm and forgotten. Upstairs, Evelyn slept the deep sleep of someone who had worked a double shift at the hospital. I could picture her exactly as she lay now, curled on her side of the bed, one hand tucked beneath the pillow, her breathing steady and peaceful. We had eaten dinner together earlier, discussing Marcus's upcoming soccer tryouts and Clara's need for new school clothes. Our conversation had followed its familiar rhythm, each of us playing our parts with practiced precision. She had asked about my day. I had told her it was fine. She had mentioned the neighbor's new fence. I had nodded and cut another piece of chicken. The silence in the house pressed against me now, heavier than any sound. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds of a house settling into the night. I loosened my tie completely and let it fall beside me on the couch, a dark ribbon against the beige cushions. This was my ritual now, these late hours alone with the television's glow and my own restless thoughts. Evelyn had stopped asking why I came to bed so late. Perhaps she was relieved to have the space to herself, to spread out across the mattress without having to navigate around my presence. Our marriage had become a careful choreography over the years, each of us moving through our steps with practiced grace, rarely bumping into each other, rarely missing our marks. But tonight, as I stared at the screen without really seeing it, my mind drifted somewhere else entirely. The memory came without invitation, sharp and vivid despite the years that had passed. I was 21 again, sitting in Nathaniel's dorm room, the same kind of late-night football game playing on his small television. We had been studying together, or pretending to study, our textbooks scattered across his narrow bed, our bodies close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and warm that made me want to breathe deeper. Nathaniel had been my closest friend that year, the kind of friendship that felt effortless and natural, built on shared jokes and long conversations that stretched until morning. He was studying literature while I focused on accounting, but somehow we found endless things to talk about. He had this way of listening that made me feel heard, really heard, in a way that was both comfortable and terrifying. That night, as we half watched the game and half discussed our upcoming finals, his hand had moved closer to mine on the bed. It was subtle at first, just the natural shift of someone getting more comfortable. But then his fingers brushed against mine, a touch so light it could have been accidental. Except it wasn't accidental. It lingered, warm and deliberate. And for a moment, I felt something electric pass between us, something I had no words for but recognized in the deepest part of myself. I had pulled away too quickly, too abruptly, mumbling something about needing to get back to my own room. Nathaniel had simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral, but I caught something in his eyes that looked like disappointment. Or maybe understanding. I had gathered my books with shaking hands and left, and we had never spoken of that moment again. Now, 20 years later, I could still feel the ghost of that touch, the warmth of his skin against mine, the way my whole body had responded to something as simple as fingers brushing together. I had spent decades trying to forget that feeling, burying it beneath layers of responsibility and routine, beneath the weight of the life I had built. But here, alone in the dark with the television's cold light washing over me, the memory felt as vivid and immediate as if it had happened yesterday. I reached for the whiskey glass, finally lifting it to my lips and taking a small sip. The liquid burned going down, a welcome distraction from the ache that had settled in my chest. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, other families tucked safely into their homes, their own late-night rituals playing out behind lit windows. But I remained here, suspended between the life I had chosen and the moment I had walked away from, wondering what would have happened if I had been brave enough to let his hand stay where it was. The house where I had built my life was modest in every sense of the word. 2 stories of pale yellow siding, a front porch with white railings that I repainted every 3 years, and a lawn that I maintained with the kind of precision that made our neighbors nod approvingly when they passed on their evening walks. Inside, Evelyn had chosen beige for most of the walls, a safe neutral that made the rooms feel larger, she said. Family photographs lined the hallway in matching frames, chronicling birthdays and holidays and school events with the careful documentation of a life well lived. There was Marcus at 8, gap-toothed and proud in his Little League uniform. Clara at 10, serious and focused during her first piano recital. Evelyn and me on our wedding day, younger versions of ourselves smiling at a camera, her hand resting on my chest, my arm around her waist in the pose the photographer had arranged. We looked happy in that photograph. I remembered being happy, or at least believing I was happy, which felt like the same thing at the time. Evelyn worked the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital 3 times a week, coming home in the early morning hours with stories of difficult patients and understaffed wards. She was good at her job, the kind of nurse that families requested by name. Someone who could find a vein on the first try and knew exactly what to say when someone was scared. At home, she moved through our routines with the same competent efficiency, managing schedules and grocery lists and the endless logistics of raising 2 teenagers. Marcus was 17 now, tall and broad-shouldered like his grandfather, spending most of his free time either at soccer practice or in his room with his headphones on. He had inherited Evelyn's practical nature and my tendency toward quietness, though in him it manifested as a kind of focused determination that I envied. He knew what he wanted, this son of mine. College, maybe a scholarship, a future that stretched ahead of him with clear boundaries and achievable goals. Clara, 15, was more like me in temperament, but had her mother's fierce loyalty and protective instincts. She was in her 3rd year of high school theater, always rehearsing for some production or another, coming home late with her cheeks still flushed from the stage lights. She had Evelyn's eyes, dark and expressive, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see more than you intended to reveal. Sometimes I caught her watching me during dinner, her head tilted slightly, as if she was trying to solve some puzzle I hadn't realized I was presenting. Our dinners followed a predictable rhythm. Evelyn would ask about their days while serving plates of whatever she had prepared between getting home and starting her shift. Marcus would mumble responses between bites. Clara would launch into detailed accounts of drama club politics or her latest English assignment. I would contribute when prompted, asking about upcoming games or auditions, offering advice about time management or study habits. We functioned like a well-oiled machine, each of us playing our roles with practiced efficiency. But underneath the surface of these ordinary interactions, I felt a restlessness that I couldn't name or explain. It wasn't dissatisfaction exactly, more like a sense of something missing, some piece of myself that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. Evelyn sensed it. I knew she did. She had started watching me more carefully during our conversations, the way Clara did, as if she was looking for clues to something she couldn't quite identify. She would ask if everything was all right at work. I would tell her yes, and it wasn't a lie. The accounting firm where I had worked for the past 15 years was stable and predictable, my colleagues pleasant enough, my responsibilities manageable. I was good at my job in the same way Evelyn was good at hers, with quiet competence and attention to detail. But sitting in my office day after day, reviewing spreadsheets and preparing reports, I sometimes felt like I was watching my life from a great distance, as if I was an actor who had been playing the same role for so long that I had forgotten it was just a performance. My colleagues knew me as Reliable Malcolm, the one who always met his deadlines and remembered to bring donuts for birthday celebrations. I attended their retirement parties and baby showers, made appropriate small talk during lunch breaks, and maintained the kind of cordial professional relationships that felt substantial enough without requiring too much of myself. They probably would have described me as quiet but friendly, competent but unremarkable, the kind of person who blended into the background of other people's stories. At home, After Clara had finished her homework and Marcus had emerged from his room long enough to grab a snack, after Evelyn had settled into bed with a book or fallen asleep from exhaustion, I would find myself in the living room again. Night after night, I would turn on the television and lower the volume until it was barely audible, creating a pocket of solitude in the house that felt both necessary and lonely. These were the hours when my mind wandered most freely, when I allowed myself to think about things I kept buried during the daylight hours. I would sit in my chair, the remote control balanced on my knee, and let my thoughts drift to places I usually refused to let them go. Sometimes I thought about the choices I had made, the paths I had taken, and the ones I had walked away from. Sometimes I thought about the man I had become and wondered if he was the man I had always intended to be. The television provided a comfortable backdrop for these late-night contemplations, the flicker of light and movement creating just enough distraction to keep my thoughts from becoming too intense or uncomfortable. Sports were best for this purpose, the predictable rhythms of games and commentary providing a kind of white noise that allowed my mind to wander without getting caught in any particular worry or regret. But increasingly, as I sat alone in those quiet hours, I found myself thinking about connection, about intimacy, about the difference between being loved and being truly known. Evelyn loved me, I had no doubt about that. She had chosen to build a life with me, had carried our children and created our home, and shared 20 years of ordinary moments that had woven themselves into something that looked like happiness from the outside. Yet lying in bed beside her at night, listening to her breathe, I sometimes felt lonelier than I had when I was actually alone. It wasn't her fault, this distance between us. She had done nothing wrong, had been nothing but faithful and kind and patient with my moods and silences. The fault lay somewhere deeper, in some fundamental disconnect between the person I appeared to be and the person I felt myself to be in those unguarded moments when no one was watching. I had become skilled at managing this disconnect, at compartmentalizing the restlessness so that it didn't interfere with my obligations as a husband and father. But some nights, sitting in the blue glow of the television, I wondered what would happen if I stopped managing it so carefully, if I allowed myself to examine too closely the source of this persistent ache that lived just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed life. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements that the mailman deposited in our box each day. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was another credit card offer or local business flyer. But something about the handwriting on the front, careful and unfamiliar, made me pause as I stood in the kitchen sorting through the day's delivery. Inside was a simple invitation, printed on cream-colored cardstock with the kind of casual formality that suggested someone had put thought into it without trying too hard. A college reunion, it said, though not the official kind with banquet halls and name tags. Just a group of friends from our old dorm getting together to watch the season opener at Murphy's, a sports bar downtown that hadn't existed when we were students, but apparently served decent wings and had enough televisions to satisfy a crowd. The name at the bottom of the invitation was Brian Kellerman, someone I remembered vaguely as a pre-med student who lived down the hall during my junior year. We hadn't been particularly close, but college has a way of creating connections that feel deeper than they actually are, bonds forged through proximity and shared circumstances rather than genuine compatibility. I studied the list of names he had included, people he was hoping to track down and invite, recognizing some and drawing blanks on others. Nathaniel Morrison was third on the list. I set the invitation on the counter and continued opening the rest of the mail, but my eyes kept drifting back to that name. 20 years had passed since I had last seen him, since that awkward departure from his dorm room that had effectively ended our friendship. I wondered what he looked like now, whether he had gotten married, had children, built the kind of life I had built, whether he ever thought about that night, about the moment when everything had shifted between us and I had been too frightened to let it happen. When Evelyn came home from her shift that evening, I mentioned the invitation casually, as if it were just another piece of uninteresting mail. She was tired, moving through the kitchen with the slow, careful steps of someone who had been on her feet for 12 hours, but she stopped when I showed her the card. "You should go," she said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. "You never do anything for yourself." There was something in her voice, a quality I couldn't quite identify. Not accusation exactly, but perhaps a kind of gentle observation that carried more weight than the simple words suggested. I told her it was probably not worth the trouble, that I had lost touch with most of those people for good reasons, that spending an evening making small talk with near strangers about careers and children sounded exhausting rather than enjoyable. But she insisted, with the kind of quiet persistence that made me realize this was more important to her than I had initially understood. "When was the last time you saw any of your college friends?" she asked. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to do it, not because it was necessary or expected or responsible?" I couldn't answer those questions, not honestly. The truth was that I had let most of those friendships fade away naturally, through geographic distance and changing priorities and the simple passage of time. It had seemed easier to focus on the life I was building rather than maintaining connections to the person I had been. But sitting across from Evelyn at our kitchen table, watching her cradle her teacup with the same gentle care she used with her patients, I realized that maybe she was offering me something I didn't know I needed. So I called Brian Kellerman and told him I would come. Murphy's was crowded that Friday night, filled with the kind of enthusiastic energy that surrounds the start of football season. I arrived a few minutes late, scanning the room for familiar faces and finding mostly strangers. But then I spotted Brian near the bar, older and heavier than I remembered, but unmistakable, waving me over with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I had found him overwhelming in college. He introduced me to the others who had shown up, a smaller group than expected, but large enough to claim a section of tables near one of the larger screens. There was Jennifer Martinez, who had become a veterinarian and brought photos of her 3 daughters. Dave Chun, now an engineer in Seattle, visiting his parents for the weekend. A few others whose names I recognized, but whose faces had changed enough that I might not have known them if I had encountered them randomly on the street. And then, just as the game was starting and I was beginning to settle into the comfortable rhythm of catching up with people I barely remembered, I saw him across the room. Nathaniel was standing near the entrance, scanning the crowd the same way I had done when I arrived. He was older, certainly, his dark hair now showing gray at the temples, his shoulders broader than they had been in college, his face carrying the kind of lines that come from 20 years of experience. But there was something essentially unchanged about him, something that made my chest tighten with recognition and a dozen other emotions I wasn't prepared to feel. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment everything else seemed to recede. The noise of the bar, the cheering from the televisions, the conversations happening around me, all of it faded into background as we looked at each other with the kind of intensity that made me remember exactly why I had fled from his dorm room all those years ago. He made his way over to our group, accepting greetings and handshakes from the others, but I could feel his attention focused on me even as he engaged in the expected pleasantries. When he finally reached me, his smile was warm but cautious, as if he wasn't entirely sure what kind of reception he would receive. "Malcolm," he said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you." His handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary, his fingers warm against mine, and I felt that same electric current I remembered from college, that sense of connection that went deeper than friendship, but had no name I was willing to acknowledge. The evening passed more easily than I had expected. The conversation flowed naturally between shared memories and current updates, the kind of catching up that feels both superficial and surprisingly intimate. Nathaniel had become a literature professor at a small college in Vermont, had never married, spoke about his work with the kind of passion that made me remember why I had enjoyed our long conversations as students. He asked about my family, my job, the ordinary details of my life, and I found myself being more honest than I usually was with strangers, or even with friends. As the night progressed and some of the others began to leave, our group grew smaller and our conversation more personal. Nathaniel and I found ourselves sitting closer together, our chairs angled toward each other in a way that created a pocket of privacy within the larger gathering. He told me about a book he was writing, a scholarly work on contemporary fiction that sounded both ambitious and genuinely interesting. I found myself talking about things I rarely discussed with anyone: my frustration with the predictability of my work, my sense that I was living someone else's idea of what my life should be. Near the end of the evening, as Brian was settling the tab and the others were gathering their coats, Nathaniel turned to me with an expression that was both casual and carefully considered. "We should do this again sometime," he said. "Just the two of us. Like old times. Maybe catch a game at my place. Actually be able to hear ourselves think." I agreed before I had fully processed what I was saying, the words emerging from some part of me that had been waiting 20 years to respond to an invitation I thought would never come again. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how quickly and definitively the answer came. "I would like that." As we exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans for the following weekend, I felt something stirring in my chest that I recognized, but had spent decades trying to ignore. It was anticipation mixed with fear, excitement tempered by the weight of everything I stood to lose if I allowed myself to feel what I was feeling. Driving home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, past the houses where my neighbors slept peacefully in their beds, I gripped the steering wheel and tried to convince myself that this was just rekindling an old friendship, nothing more complicated or dangerous than that. But even as I formed the thought, I knew it wasn't true. Something had been awakened that night, something I had successfully buried for 20 years, and I wasn't sure I had the strength or the desire to bury it again. Nathaniel's apartment was nothing like the home Evelyn and I had built together. Where our house was careful and coordinated, his space felt lived in and authentic, books stacked on every available surface, plants crowding the windowsills, artwork that actually meant something to him rather than matching the color scheme. His couch was worn leather, soft and comfortable in the way that only comes from years of use, positioned perfectly in front of a television that was smaller than ours, but somehow made the room feel more intimate rather than less impressive. Our first evening together felt almost like a continuation of that night at Murphy's, easy and familiar despite the 20 years that had passed since we had last spent time alone together. He had invited me over to watch Thursday night football, nothing more complicated than that. But as I sat in his living room with a beer in my hand, I realized how long it had been since I had felt this relaxed in someone else's presence. The game provided a comfortable backdrop for conversation, something to look at when the silences stretched too long or the topics became too personal. But as the evening progressed, I found myself paying less attention to what was happening on screen and more attention to the man sitting beside me. Nathaniel had always been a good listener, but now, with the perspective that comes with age and experience, his attention felt like a gift I hadn't realized I needed. When I mentioned my frustration with a particularly difficult client at work, he didn't offer solutions or try to minimize my annoyance the way Evelyn might have. Instead, he asked questions that helped me understand what was really bothering me about the situation. When I found myself talking about Marcus's increasing distance, the way my teenage son seemed to be moving through the house like a stranger, Nathaniel simply nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from someone who remembers what it felt like to be 17 and desperate to become someone other than who your parents expected you to be. As I drove home that night, I realized I had talked more about myself in those few hours than I usually did in entire weeks at home. Not about schedules or logistics or the surface details that filled most of my conversations with Evelyn, but about things that actually mattered to me. My disappointment with the predictability of my career, my worry that I was failing somehow as a father, my sense that life was passing me by while I went through the motions of living it. The following week, when he called to suggest we watch Sunday's game together, I accepted without hesitation. This time, our conversation ranged even further from safe topics. He told me about a student who reminded him of himself at that age, confused and searching for something he couldn't name. I found myself talking about Clara's intensity, the way she threw herself completely into her theater productions with a passion I envied and worried about in equal measure. These Sunday evenings became a ritual neither of us named, but both of us anticipated. Week after week, I would make excuses to Evelyn about needing to get out of the house, about wanting to catch the game somewhere with better reception or fewer distractions. She never questioned these explanations, probably relieved to have a few hours of quiet with the children without having to navigate around my restless energy. At Nathaniel's apartment, I discovered parts of myself I had forgotten existed. My laughter came more easily, less calculated and self-conscious than it had become at home. I found myself making observations about the games we watched, the books on his shelves, the stories he told about his students, with a sharpness and humor that felt like remembering how to speak a language I had once been fluent in but had somehow stopped using. He had a way of listening that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When I talked about the growing distance between Evelyn and me, the sense that we had become business partners managing a household rather than lovers sharing a life, he didn't offer platitudes about marriage requiring work or suggest counseling or any of the solutions that well-meaning friends usually provided. Instead, he asked me what I missed most about the early days of our relationship, and when I struggled to answer that question honestly, he let the silence stretch until I was ready to admit that I wasn't sure I had ever felt truly connected to Evelyn in the way I thought married couples were supposed to be. Our conversations grew longer and more personal as the weeks passed. I began arriving earlier and staying later, both of us reluctant to end evenings that felt increasingly necessary to my sense of well-being. Sometimes we would sit in comfortable silence, the television providing background noise while we read or simply existed in each other's presence without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. I started to notice small details about him that I had forgotten or perhaps never properly observed when we were younger. The way he concentrated when he was thinking, his forehead creasing slightly as he considered whatever point I had just made. How he moved around his kitchen when he was getting us drinks or snacks, economical and graceful in a way that suggested he was comfortable in his own space and his own skin. The sound of his voice when he was relaxed, lower and warmer than it became when he was teaching or interacting with people he knew less well. But more than anything, I noticed how different I felt in his presence. The chronic restlessness that had become my constant companion at home seemed to quiet when I was with him. The sense of performing a role, of being carefully watched and evaluated against some standard I could never quite identify, simply disappeared. I could sit on his couch and feel my shoulders relax, could speak without weighing every word for its potential to cause problems or reveal too much. One evening, as we were discussing a book he had recommended, something about the nature of male friendship in contemporary literature, our conversation took a turn toward more personal territory. He asked me whether I had close friends, real friends, people I could talk to about things that mattered. The question caught me off guard because I realized the answer was no, not really. I had colleagues I got along with, neighbors I was cordial with, other parents I interacted with at school events, but no one I could call when I was struggling or excited or just needed to hear a familiar voice. Except him, I realized. Somehow, over the course of these weekly evenings, Nathaniel had become the person I most looked forward to talking with, the person whose opinion I valued, whose company made me feel more like myself than I felt anywhere else. He seemed to understand something about me that I was only beginning to understand about myself. When I talked about feeling trapped by the life I had built, he didn't try to convince me that I should be grateful for my blessings or remind me of my responsibilities. When I mentioned the dreams I had abandoned, the writing I had done in college that I had dismissed as impractical once I needed to support a family, he asked me whether I ever thought about returning to it, and his question felt like permission to consider possibilities I had trained myself to ignore. The physical space between us on his couch seemed to shrink gradually over the weeks, so subtly that I might not have noticed if I hadn't become hyper-aware of his presence in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. We would sit closer together when we were looking at something on his laptop, our shoulders touching as we leaned in to read an article or watch a video he wanted to share. Sometimes, when we were both relaxed and the conversation had grown quiet, I would become acutely aware of the warmth of his body next to mine, the way his breathing had synchronized with mine without either of us trying to make it happen. These moments of physical proximity stirred something in me that I had spent 20 years trying to ignore a kind of awareness that went far beyond friendship, but that I still couldn't allow myself to name or acknowledge directly. I would drive home from these evenings in a state of heightened sensitivity, every nerve ending alert, replaying conversations and moments of connection with an intensity that felt both wonderful and dangerous. At home, Evelyn began to notice my distraction, the way I seemed to be mentally elsewhere even when I was physically present. She would ask me questions during dinner that I wouldn't hear the first time, or catch me staring out the window with an expression she couldn't read. Once, she asked me directly if everything was all right, if there was something on my mind that I needed to talk about. I told her I was fine, just tired from work, maybe stressed about some upcoming deadlines. The lie came easily, practiced from years of deflecting conversations that might lead to uncomfortable revelations. She accepted my explanation with the kind of patient understanding that made me feel even more guilty about my deception, but also reinforced my sense that she didn't really want to know what I was thinking about during those moments when I seemed most distant. The truth was that I was thinking about Nathaniel constantly, not just during the hours we spent together, but throughout my days, replaying conversations, anticipating our next meeting, imagining what it would be like to talk with him about whatever was on my mind at any given moment. He had become a presence in my mental landscape that colored everything else, a point of reference that made me more aware of what was missing from the rest of my life. I began to notice how different I felt at work on Mondays after spending Sunday evening with him. There was an energy in my interactions with colleagues, a sense of engagement that carried over from our conversations into the mundane details of spreadsheets and client meetings. I found myself thinking more clearly, speaking up in ways I usually didn't, bringing a perspective to problem solving that felt both more creative and more confident than my typical approach. But it was the silences between us that affected me most profoundly. Not the awkward pauses that sometimes occurred in conversations with other people, but the comfortable quiet that would settle over us when we had talked ourselves into a state of complete understanding. These silences felt alive, charged with connection and possibility, and sitting in them with Nathaniel felt like the most natural thing in the world, while simultaneously being the most terrifying experience I had allowed myself in 20 years. The game that evening was meaningless, some Thursday night matchup between teams neither of us particularly cared about, but it provided the familiar excuse we had grown comfortable with over the past few months. I arrived at Nathaniel's apartment carrying the usual six-pack of beer and the assumption that we would settle into our regular pattern of conversation and comfortable silences, but from the moment he opened the door, something felt different. He seemed more subdued than usual, less immediately talkative, and as we settled onto his couch with the television casting its usual glow across the room, I noticed that he appeared to be lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with football. The commentary filled the space between us, but neither of us was really watching. Instead, we talked about inconsequential things, work and weather and a book he had just finished reading, our conversation feeling almost like a prelude to something neither of us was ready to name. As the evening progressed, I became aware of a shift in the physical space between us. It happened gradually, so subtly that I might have attributed it to the natural relaxation that comes from spending time together. But there was an intentionality to it that I recognized even as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. When Nathaniel reached for his beer, he didn't lean away from me afterward. When I adjusted my position on the couch, he seemed to mirror the movement, maintaining the decreased distance rather than returning to our usual careful spacing. The warmth of his presence beside me became impossible to ignore. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could sense the rhythm of his breathing, could catch the faint scent of his cologne that had become so familiar over these months of Thursday and Sunday evenings together. Every nerve ending seemed hyper-aware of his proximity, and I found myself holding very still, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell was settling over us. The game continued on the screen, players moving back and forth across the field in patterns that held no meaning for either of us. The commentary became background noise, a steady murmur that seemed to fade further and further into the distance as my attention focused entirely on the man sitting beside me. I could hear him breathing, could feel the slight movement of the couch cushions when he shifted his weight, could sense something building between us that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Then, without any warning or preamble, his leg pressed against mine. Not accidentally, not the casual contact that sometimes occurred when we were both getting comfortable, but a deliberate connection that sent electricity through my entire body. The warmth of his thigh against mine felt like the most significant thing that had ever happened to me, and I sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, afraid to respond but equally afraid to pull away. For several minutes, we remained like that, connected by this single point of contact while the television continued to flicker in front of us, and neither of us acknowledged what was happening. I could feel my heart beating so hard I was certain he must be able to hear it, could feel the blood rushing through my veins in a way that made me dizzy and hyper-alert at the same time. And then, as if the pressure of that connection had been building toward this moment all evening, his hand moved toward mine. It happened slowly, deliberately, his fingers tracing a path across the couch cushion between us until they encountered my hand resting on my knee. The initial contact was feather-light, just the tips of his fingers brushing against my knuckles, but the sensation shot through me like lightning. My immediate instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the safety of distance and pretense, to preserve the careful equilibrium we had maintained for all these months. It was the same impulse I had felt 20 years ago in his dorm room, the same fear that had sent me fleeing into the hallway with my books clutched against my chest and my heart hammering with panic and desire. But this time, I didn't move. His fingers settled more fully against mine, and then his palm pressed against the back of my hand with a warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body. We sat there in silence, the television forgotten, the game meaningless, our breathing the only sound that mattered in the universe. His thumb moved slightly, tracing a small circle against my skin, and I felt something inside me break open, some wall I had spent decades constructing crumbling away in the space of a heartbeat. The moment stretched between us, elastic and fragile, loaded with 20 years of history and the weight of everything we had never said to each other. I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally allowing myself to feel something I had spent so long denying. His hand was warm and solid and real, and the simple fact of that contact felt like coming home to a place I hadn't realized I had been searching for. Neither of us spoke. There were no words that could have contained what was happening between us. No way to articulate the magnitude of this simple gesture that felt like stepping off the edge of the world I had built for myself. We simply sat together, hands connected, breathing in sync, letting the reality of our connection settle into our bones. When I finally found the courage to look at him, his eyes were already on my face, studying me with an expression that held no surprise, only a kind of patient tenderness that suggested he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been running from it. There was no judgment in his gaze, no demand for explanation or commitment, just the quiet acknowledgement that something had finally been allowed to exist between us that we had both known was there all along. The spell was broken eventually, though I'm not sure how much time had passed. The game ended, credits rolled. The room grew quieter without the steady background noise of commentary. We separated slowly, reluctantly, his hand sliding away from mine with a gentleness that felt like a promise rather than a goodbye. He asked if I wanted another beer. I said I should probably head home. We both knew that something irrevocable had occurred, but neither of us seemed ready to discuss what it meant or what came next. As I gathered my jacket and keys, moving through the familiar ritual of departure, I felt like I was walking through a dream. Everything looked the same as it always did, his apartment, his books, the empty beer bottles on the coffee table, but everything felt fundamentally different. I had crossed some invisible line, had allowed myself to experience something I had forbidden for 20 years, and there was no way to return to the person I had been when I arrived that evening. He walked me to the door as he always did, but this time he stood closer, and when I turned to say goodbye, the space between us felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Thank you," he said quietly, and I knew he wasn't thanking me for coming over to watch the game. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to respond. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs and familiar turns that I navigated automatically while my mind reeled from what had just happened. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and I had to consciously remind myself to pay attention to traffic signals and speed limits. Every few blocks, I would replay the moment when his hand had settled against mine, the weight and warmth of that connection, the way it had felt both completely natural and utterly transformative. My chest felt strange, as if my ribcage was simultaneously too tight and too loose, as if my heart was too big for the space it occupied, but also somehow lighter than it had been in years. I kept taking deep breaths, trying to process the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me, trying to make sense of what had just changed in my carefully ordered world. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, past Evelyn's car and Marcus's bicycle, and all the familiar markers of the life I had built, I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The house looked exactly as I had left it, warm light glowing from the living room windows, the porch light casting its welcoming circle on the front steps. But as I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, I felt like a stranger approaching someone else's home, someone else's family, someone else's existence. Inside, Evelyn was reading in her chair, Marcus was in his room with his headphones on. Clara was at her desk finishing homework. The evening routine continued exactly as it always did, but I moved through it feeling like I was watching myself from a great distance, going through the motions of being a husband and father while some essential part of me remained in Nathaniel's apartment, connected to him by the memory of his hand against mine. Later, lying in bed beside my wife, listening to her steady breathing and staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I realized that I had finally allowed myself to feel something I had been afraid of my entire adult life. And now that I had felt it, now that I knew what it was like to be truly seen and accepted by someone who understood the parts of me I had never been able to share, I wasn't sure I could go back to pretending it didn't exist. The days following that evening at Nathaniel's apartment felt like walking through water. Every movement requiring more effort than it should, every interaction filtered through the memory of his hand against mine. I moved through my routines at home and work with the same mechanical precision I had developed over 20 years, but underneath the familiar motions, something fundamental had shifted. At breakfast, when Evelyn asked about my plans for the weekend, I found myself hesitating before answering, weighing each word against the possibility that she might hear something in my voice that I wasn't ready to explain. When Marcus complained about his soccer coach, I nodded and offered appropriate responses, but part of my mind was replaying the moment when Nathaniel's thumb had traced that small circle against my skin. During meetings at work, I caught myself staring out the window, thinking not about spreadsheets or quarterly reports, but about the quiet understanding I had seen in his eyes. Evelyn began to notice my distraction in ways she hadn't before. She would repeat herself when I failed to respond to questions, would pause in the middle of sentences to study my face with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for her patients. I could feel her watching me during dinner, trying to decipher whatever it was she saw there that didn't match the husband she thought she knew. The weight of carrying this secret, this newfound awareness of myself, began to press against my chest in ways that made simple breathing feel labored. I would wake up in the middle of the night, lying beside Evelyn in the darkness, acutely aware of the distance between us that had nothing to do with the physical space we occupied in our bed. She would sleep peacefully while I stared at the ceiling, wrestling with questions I had spent decades avoiding. My next meeting with Nathaniel was scheduled for the following Sunday, but the anticipation felt different now, charged with a tension that made the intervening days seem endless. I found myself checking my phone constantly, not for messages from him, but simply to reassure myself that the number was still there, that the connection between us was still real and not something I had imagined in a moment of desperate loneliness. When Sunday finally arrived, I told Evelyn I was going to watch the game with a friend, the same explanation I had been using for months. But this time, she looked up from her book with an expression I couldn't read, something that might have been curiosity or concern or perhaps a growing suspicion she wasn't ready to voice. At Nathaniel's apartment, we both seemed to understand that something had changed irrevocably between us. The easy conversation that had characterized our previous meetings felt strained now, interrupted by silences that carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. We sat further apart on the couch, both of us apparently afraid of accidental contact that might force us to acknowledge what had happened the week before. The game played in the background, but neither of us was watching. Instead, we talked carefully around the edges of more personal topics, each of us seeming to test the boundaries of what was safe to discuss. When I mentioned that Evelyn had been asking more questions lately, he nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested he had anticipated this development. When he told me about a colleague who was going through a difficult divorce, I heard the unspoken question about whether such upheavals were worth the pain they caused. As the afternoon stretched on, the silence between us grew heavier, more loaded with things that needed to be said, but that neither of us seemed ready to voice. We were both waiting, I realized, for the other to name what was happening between us, to take responsibility for crossing a line we had both been approaching for months. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set outside his windows and I was gathering the mental energy to make my excuses and leave, Nathaniel turned to face me directly. The expression on his face was serious, almost grave, and I felt my chest tighten with the certainty that whatever he was about to say would change everything between us. "You don't have to keep living like this," he said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so perfectly accurate. He wasn't talking about my marriage specifically, or my job, or any single aspect of my carefully constructed life. He was talking about the fundamental dishonesty of existing as someone other than who I really was, of spending my days performing a role that required me to deny essential parts of myself. I wanted to argue with him, to insist that my life was fine, that I was happy with the choices I had made, that the alternative he was implying was too dangerous to consider. But sitting there in his living room, with the afternoon light fading around us and his words hanging in the air between us, I couldn't summon the energy to lie anymore. Not to him, and not to myself. Instead, I found myself telling him about the growing distance I felt from Evelyn, the way our conversations had become increasingly superficial over the years, focused on logistics rather than any deeper connection. I told him about lying awake at night feeling like a stranger in my own bed, about going through the motions of being a husband and father while feeling fundamentally disconnected from both roles. He listened without judgment, without trying to offer solutions or advice, and his quiet acceptance of my confusion and pain felt like the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. When I finally stopped talking, when I had exhausted my ability to explain the complexity of my situation, he simply nodded and said that he understood, that he had been waiting for me to be ready to admit what we both already knew. The drive home that evening felt like traveling between two different worlds, two different versions of myself that seemed increasingly incompatible. In one world, I was Malcolm the accountant, Malcolm the husband and father, Malcolm who lived in a house with beige walls and mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings and attended school events for his children. In the other world, I was someone I had never allowed myself to be, someone who could sit on a couch with another man and feel truly understood, truly seen, truly alive. That night, Evelyn confronted me directly for the first time. We were getting ready for bed, going through the familiar routine of brushing teeth and changing clothes, when she suddenly stopped in the middle of folding laundry and looked at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "Is there someone else?" she asked quietly. The question hung between us like a physical presence, demanding an answer I wasn't prepared to give. I could have lied easily enough, could have reassured her with the kind of emphatic denial that would have ended the conversation and restored the careful equilibrium we had maintained for so many years. But something in her voice, a quality of genuine fear and genuine need to know the truth, made deception impossible. "I don't know how to answer that," I said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. She stared at me for a long moment, her hands still clutching the shirt she had been folding, and I could see her processing not just my words, but everything they implied about our marriage, about the person she thought she had been living with for 20 years. "That's not a no," she said, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "No," I agreed. "It's not a no." We stood there in our bedroom, surrounded by all the accumulated evidence of our shared life, and I felt the first real crack appear in the foundation of everything I had built. She didn't ask me any more questions that night, and I didn't offer any more explanations. But something had been acknowledged between us that could never be taken back, some truth that would color every interaction we had going forward. Over the following weeks, I found myself living in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward, but equally unable to retreat to the safety of ignorance. Evelyn and I spoke carefully around the edges of what I had revealed, neither of us ready to fully examine what it meant for our marriage, but both of us aware that something fundamental had shifted. She stopped asking about my evening plans, stopped commenting on my distraction, but the silence felt heavy with unspoken questions and growing distance. With Nathaniel, the tension continued to build even as we both seemed determined to avoid naming what was happening between us. We continued our regular meetings, but the easy intimacy we had developed was now complicated by the weight of everything we weren't saying. He would look at me sometimes with an expression that seemed to be asking a question I wasn't ready to answer, and I would find myself studying his face with an intensity that felt both necessary and dangerous. The choice I was facing wasn't the kind that could be made in a single dramatic moment, with clear alternatives and obvious consequences. Instead, it was being made in accumulation, in the silence that followed Evelyn's questions, in the way I hesitated before answering her calls, in the increasing frequency with which I found excuses to see Nathaniel, in the growing awareness that I was living a life that no longer fit the person I was becoming. Each day that passed without resolution felt like another small step away from the marriage I had built and towards something unknown and terrifying and possibly necessary. I wasn't choosing between Evelyn and Nathaniel exactly, but between continuing to live as someone I wasn't and risking everything to discover who I might actually be. I am back in the living room where this all began, though everything has changed now except the television and its familiar glow. The same game plays in endless replay, men colliding and separating on the screen, but I am not watching. The volume is turned down low, the way it always was during those late nights when I couldn't sleep, when I would sit here and try to make sense of the restlessness that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. Evelyn is gone now, staying at her sister's house across town. The conversation that led to her leaving was quieter than I had expected, more sad than angry, filled with long pauses and careful words that we both knew couldn't repair what had been broken between us. She didn't ask for details about Nathaniel, didn't demand confessions or explanations that would have been painful for both of us to hear. Instead, she simply told me that she had known for weeks that I was somewhere else, even when I was sitting right beside her. "I need some time to think," she had said, folding clothes into a suitcase with the same careful precision she brought to everything else in her life. "The children can stay here with you. They shouldn't have to leave their home because we couldn't figure out how to stay married." Marcus and Clara move through the house now with the cautious awareness of teenagers who understand that their family is changing in ways they don't fully comprehend. They ask polite questions about when their mother will be back, accept my vague answers about her needing space, and retreat to their rooms where they can process this disruption in private. Clara brought me a cup of coffee this morning without being asked, a small gesture of care that nearly broke my heart. Marcus has been doing his homework at the kitchen table instead of his room, perhaps wanting to be closer to whatever stability remains. The coffee table in front of me holds two objects that have become the physical representation of everything I am wrestling with. My wedding ring sits on the left side, the gold band that has circled my finger for 20 years now looking smaller and more fragile than I remember. I removed it yesterday morning, not in anger or as some grand gesture of rejection, but simply because its weight had become unbearable, a constant reminder of promises I was no longer sure I could keep. Beside it, folded carefully into a small square, is the piece of paper where I wrote Nathaniel's number weeks ago, when we first began meeting regularly. I have memorized those digits, could dial them without looking, but I keep the paper anyway as a tangible connection to the possibility of becoming someone other than who I have been for the past 2 decades. They sit there together on the wooden surface, these two symbols of different versions of my life, and I know with absolute certainty that I cannot hold both in the same hand. The choice that has been building for months, that I have been avoiding and circling around and trying to postpone, has finally condensed into this simple moment of reaching toward one or the other. Outside, the neighborhood is quiet in the way it always is on weekday evenings. Other families moving through their routines behind lit windows, their lives continuing in patterns that once seemed like the only way to exist in the world. I can see the Johnsons' kitchen window from where I sit, can watch them moving around their table in the familiar choreography of dinner and cleanup and homework supervision that I once believed was the natural rhythm of adult happiness. The silence in my own house feels different from the silence that used to press against me during those late nights when Evelyn slept upstairs and I sat here, wrestling with nameless dissatisfaction. This quiet is not empty but full, charged with the weight of decisions made and the possibility of decisions yet to come. It is the silence that follows honesty, when all the careful pretenses have been stripped away and what remains is simply what is true. I think about the conversation I had with Nathaniel 3 days ago, when I finally told him about Evelyn's questions, about the growing impossibility of continuing to live as I had been living. He listened with the same patient attention he had always given me, but I could see something new in his expression, a kind of guarded hope that made my chest tight with the magnitude of what he was offering without saying. "You know you always have a place with me," he had said quietly when I finished explaining the situation at home. "Whatever you decide, whatever you need, I'm here." It wasn't a demand or an ultimatum, wasn't pressure to leave my marriage for the promise of something specific with him. It was simply an acknowledgement that there was space in his life for whatever version of myself I might choose to become, an offer of acceptance without conditions or requirements. The game on the television ends and another begins, the cycle continuing without pause or resolution, but I am no longer paying attention to the screen. Instead, I am thinking about the difference between safety and happiness, between the life I have built and the life I might still be able to live. 20 years ago, I pulled my hand away from Nathaniel's in fear of what that touch might mean, what it might require me to become. Last month, I let his hand stay on mine and felt something I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. The children will be fine, I tell myself, because they are resilient and loved, and because sometimes the kindest thing parents can do is show their children that it is possible to choose authenticity over comfort, truth over convenience. Evelyn will be fine too, though it may take time for her to believe that this ending is not a failure, but a recognition that we both deserve to be with someone who can love us completely, without reservation or pretense. I reach forward slowly, my hand hovering over the coffee table for a moment that stretches like the space between one breath and the next. The wedding ring catches the light from the television, 20 years of shared history gleaming in that simple band of gold. But it is the piece of paper I take, unfolding it carefully to see Nathaniel's number written in my own handwriting, the digits that represent not just a phone call, but a choice to stop running from who I am. I place the paper in my wallet, not as a grand declaration or a dramatic gesture of rebellion, but simply as an acknowledgement that I am finally ready to stop turning away from the possibility of being truly known by someone who sees me clearly and chooses to stay anyway. Tomorrow I will call him. Tonight, I will sit here in the quiet and let myself feel the weight of choosing hope over fear, truth over safety, the terrifying freedom of finally allowing myself to become who I have always been beneath the careful construction of who I thought I should be.